You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, Imperial Yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. The malting process involves allowing raw grains to steep until germination occurs, during which the starches are enzymatically broken down. This process is then cut off through drying in a hot kiln or roaster, which these days is typically powered by electricity. However, back in the early days of brewing, germinated grains would be dried via fire, the smoke of which would have a notable influence on the flavor of the finished malt. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the classic German style known as Rauchbier is contributor Steve Thanos.
Hey, Marshall. I'm really excited about talking about this one. There's a few of us within the cohorts of Brewlosophy that enjoy a good smoked beer, myself included. And I am really excited about talking about this one with you today. Yeah,
me too. And over the years, I've made certain comments that have led some to believe that I'm not a fan of certain styles of beer, which I guess I sort of understand, even if it's not true. I mean, I may not be the biggest fan of styles like hazy IPA or Weiss beer, but I won't complain if served one, and will often order at least a sample, if I see a new one on tap at one of my local breweries. That said, Rauchbier is a style I genuinely struggle to enjoy. I am not among the cohort of people in Brewlosophy who enjoy this style, which is kind of odd given how much I love smoked food, I guess. That's the comment that friends have made to me. To me, smoked beers always taste either of bacon or they have this kind of like plasticky, rubbery phenol flavor that I find quite unenjoyable. Don't get me wrong, I've had a few smoked beers that I was able to finish the full pint of, but suffice to say, Rauchbier is not a style you're going to find me ordering at the pub. Still, I love that it exists. I appreciate that others love it, and I look forward to chatting about it with you today, Steve. All right, if you enjoy this show, we'd love for you to consider joining the Brew Crew by becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, which you can do over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, July of 2024, brewing and beer steward instructor at Dakota County Technical College in Rosemont, Minnesota, Andrew Burns, will be taking questions from patrons. In addition to his vast experience in both home and professional brewing, Andrew has been a guest on the Brew Lab podcast where he discussed the various options for acquiring a brewing education, which all of us here at Brewlosophy agree is very important, especially for those who might be considering going pro. Andrew's going to be hanging out with patrons on Saturday, July 27th, 2024. So make sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday the 26th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allow you to leave those ratings and reviews, we really would appreciate that as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who in addition to having a remarkable YouTube channel chock full of great brewing related content, sell what we believe to be some of the best electric brewing systems on the market. If you've been considering making the move from propane to electric, you owe it to yourself to check out Clawhammer Supply. Whether you're after a 120 volt 5-gallon unit or something bigger like their powerful 240 volt 10-gallon system, Clawhammer has got you covered. Learn more about everything they have to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to check out their YouTube channel as well. Listener Renaud Plancha wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 332, where we focused on brewing education. Renaud says, days after you aired episode 332 on brewing education, Google announced the integration of AI to its main search engine with AI Overview. It basically gives an overview of the answers you might be looking for on a website right on the Google page. It'll summarize the page and feed it to you on the Google page. Let's say you're looking for the quick logering method and type it into the Google search bar. No more need to visit the website. website. You get the point form version delivered in nanoseconds without leaving the Google page. ChatGPT and other LLM have become increasingly good at giving brewing advice and are a very useful method on a busy brew day when you hit a problem or realize you don't have the hops you need. A quick query into ChatGPT and you have your substitution. I think AI is an increasingly present form of brewing education with real upside for the end user. The biggest downside is ad revenues for content creators like Brewlosophy. By getting a summarized version of an article without ever leaving the Google page, I'm getting the content, but you're not getting the ad money, which is one of the reasons I'm a Patreon contributor. Well, thank you, Renaud, for being a patron of ours. Steve, what do you think about ChatGPT and AI in general as a form of brewing education?
I mean, I think it's definitely plausible to think that it's a good resource. And I think the nature of ChatGPT and all the AI stuff, if I'm kind of summarizing this correctly, all it really does is literally take everything that they have in Google or wherever in the interwebs, and they summarize it for you in a neat, compact way, and they spit it back out at you. Am I understanding that correctly, pretty much?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the mechanics behind it, but yes, that is my understanding is if you ask it a question or whatever, it will spit out a condensed version of a response based on what I guess prompts you give it.
So I'm sure that to many people is fine. And I kind of go back to the old days of, being on the Facebook homebrew pages and whatnot, and people asking questions. There's still a lot of people who want that true hard advice from a human being, and they want people to say, yes, this worked for me. However, this did not work for me. This is my anecdotal experience. So there's still plenty of that out there, I think. But I think that the both can live in harmony. And I don't see there being a huge problem with it.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of with you on that. A couple things. First, I appreciate your concern about the ad revenue as well as your choosing to be a patron, Renaud. Yeah, that's awesome. So thank you so much for that. Also, I'm a big fan of technological progress. So, unlike some other people out there, it doesn't really scare me. I don't think AI is going to be taking over. That said, I don't think it's anywhere near the point to where I would fully trust it. So I've got a couple experiences that I would say verify my opinion on that. Just a couple months ago, my daughter had a track meet, and my aunt, who lives local to us, was going to meet my wife and I there to watch my daughter, do her shot put. So she texted us. My aunt texts us asking where at the elementary school she should park, and my wife responds saying that the track meet's at the high school. It's not even near the elementary school. And my aunt swears that it was because Google AI told her it was, and it made me think of that old Office episode where Michael drives into the lake because the GPS is telling him just to keep going straight at the road or whatever, and I'm not saying that it's going to completely screw you up. In fact, I'd probably contend that it's more accurate than it is not accurate, but there are going to be hiccups, and I'm cool with that. But as a solid form of education, I'm just not sure it's there yet. Maybe one day it will be. And besides the ad revenue stuff, there's a reason we include all of the details we do in our articles. Details that a brief AI synopsis are just going to leave out. To me, at least in terms of getting educated, if that's what our focus is on and not just accomplishing something quickly, that seems like too much of a shortcut. But that's just me, and this is just beer. If someone else is cool with that little small slice of info that they get from an AI summary, then by all means do it. I don't, the ad revenue. The thing a lot of people don't understand is that the way Brewlosophy, at least, I'm not sure how it works for everyone else out there, but these small businesses that are very focused on a very specific thing, the way we stay afloat is by having our fingers in a million different things. We've got Patreon, we've got ad revenue, we've got sponsors, we've got all of that stuff. The ad revenue piece of it really doesn't help us that much. It's more than enough to justify keeping the ads on the website. Don't get me wrong. But if you're having a more pleasurable experience using Google AI, then we're not going to be upset. We appreciate you taking in our content anyway. So thank you so much for hitting us up, Renaud. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback at brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy show. That's where Martin is pumping out this awesome brewing and beer related content. If you enjoy listening to this podcast, chances are you are going to love the Brewlosophy show as well. Alrighty, when we return from this break, our focus will be on Rauchbier. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
Drive into summer with the Honda CR-V and Accord, your fun-to-drive, weekend getaway vehicles. From Honda, the 2024 Kelley Blue Book's KBB.com Best Value brand. So hurry in to the Honda Summer Event. For a limited time, well-qualified buyers can get a 2.9% APR on a 2025 CR-V or 2024 Accord.
See dealer for financing details based on 2024 Consumer Choice Awards from Kelley Blue Book. Visit kbb.com for more information.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Before electricity was readily available, heat was generated by either the sun, which is finicky considering the weather or time of year, whatever time of year it is, or through fire, which requires the burning of certain materials, namely wood. Wood that, when burned, produces smoke. Now, the history of Rauchbier is intertwined with the history of modern kilning. Maybe we should start by discussing a little bit of almost brewing history in general.
Yeah, so in the early 19th century, pretty much all of the malt that was being used by brewers was actually dried over open flames, and then the smoke, really not having anywhere to go, kind of permeates the grain, and hence this kind of smokiness that you would get from grains, and just leaving this, as some might argue with me, wonderful flavor and aroma. But yeah, that was pretty much the genesis of inadvertent smoked beers, right?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, right? If they're smoking brewing is hinged on, there are very particular things in history that we know, we can look back and say that changed the course of beer and brewing, forever. And one of them was the invention of the drum kiln by Daniel Wheeler, who patented this invention in 1818, so the very early 19th century. You have to imagine, up until that point, the only effective way, we should say, I mean, I'm sure there were people out there drying, a sprouted, germinated grain in the hot sun and all of that. But the way most brewers did it, at least based on what I could find historically speaking, is they would dry it over an open flame, and that would also result in darker grains as well. So, you hear a lot of talk about how, like, back in the 19th century, brewers had access to paler malts. That's because of the drum kiln that Daniel Wheeler invented. And so up until that point, though, you've got this grain that you've germinated. The brewers at the time understood this process of needing malted grain to make the beer that they wanted. And they do it over this open flame. And back then, I think the common wood was beech wood. You can use other hardwoods as well, like oak and whatever. And they put that grain right over that. You get this nice smoky flavor imparted to the grain. It's maybe a little bit darker than it would have been otherwise. And now you have to use that in a beer. And so I do wonder, though, the fact that you look at smoked beers today, not a very big piece of the pie, of the brewing pie, in modern day brewing. But if it was the common thing way back when, and just how quickly people moved away from the smoky malt when they had access to a kiln that didn't impart that flavor, I do think it's kind of interesting. It makes me wonder if I would have been in the majority of people who maybe didn't love the beers that were there before old Mr. Willer came around.
And then kind of taking that one step further, then I'm always thinking about how can I maximize my usage of, say, for example, hops for a beer. And I can have one part, half of my 5-gallon batch with Amarillo, and then another part of my batch with Mosaic, right? And I would be wondering now if these brewers from back then were thinking, wow, now I have yet another beer I can offer to sell. And of course, trying to make more money off of. So kind of maximizing on, what's available and the technology that was available at that time. So I think that's kind of fascinating.
No, without a doubt. And, you look at how in the world today, if you had like a hotspot map and it was like, you could click a button that said Rauchbier or smoked beers, the place where it's going to glow the brightest would probably be Bamberg, which is in the Franconian city in Germany. The brewers there, the beer drinkers there, were always fond of that smoky. This is, again, I wasn't around back then, but apparently they had a real passion for these smoky beers. And so they continued with the, I'm not saying that you can't go and find a clean non-smoky beer in Bamberg. I'm sure you can.
Sure.
But they held on to that tradition and continued to design beer recipes focused specifically on that smoke character. You look at breweries like Brauerei Schlenkerla, which is in Bamberg, is a classic example of a Rauchbier brewery, which has been making beer since the 14th century. Now you think back, that was 14th century is, 400 years, almost 500 years before they even called it Rauchbier. It was just beer back then because they were doing what they could, the way that they knew how to kiln these grains. I just think it's fascinating. There are a number of other breweries in that region that are also known for their smoked beers. And there's something about that piece of it alone that I find really intriguing. I think it's so cool when a specific region holds on to something and then they become kind of known for keeping it alive. And now you've got folks like you, Steve, and there are a lot of other people out there who really do enjoy smoked beers on various levels who are able to access that and learn how to, the traditional ways of making this and what that's like because of this region that kept it alive. You wonder where would Rauchbier be today if it weren't for Bamberg?
For sure. And I wonder, what the likelihood of even Wheeler's drum kiln being invented, was there like a need for it? Like someone saying, well, it's too smoky. We need something, hey, Daniel, you're pretty creative. Why don't you come over here and invent something? I'm joking, but, kind of half not joking here because I think that there, if there's necessity, there's a need for something, then someone's going to come up with something, to, help out. But unfortunately with the drum kiln being invented, then kind of the popularity of those smoked beers kind of faded, at that time. And still today, like we've been saying, they're not too popular, but you can find them though.
Yeah, I think they're popular amongst a relatively niche market. You know what I mean?
For sure.
There are people who like them. I can't remember the last time I went into a brew pub or a brewery tap room and saw a straight up Rauchbier on tap. And I have a feeling that's going to be the one-off, 7-barrel batch in a 40-barrel brewery type of deal. Something that they brew because the brewer got interested, got an itch, and wanted to scratch it or something like that.
I have a story I'll tell you offline that will make you laugh a little.
Now every listener is like, oh God, I got to hear this story.
Yeah, I know,
No.
right? Opening up Pandora's box.
There we go. Exactly. No, but it is, and that's the fun thing about it is, as the more and more unique things get, the less and less it's going to appeal to everybody or to wider swaths of people. And the fact that there is this style of beer available to those who like it, I think is really cool. So let's go over a little bit of the BJCP style description about Rauchbier in general. We'll also hit on some of the more traditional ways of brewing it. The BJCP provides an overall impression or description of this style as a beechwood smoked malty amber German lager, the expected Märzen profile of toasty rich malt, restrained bitterness, clean fermentation, and a relatively dry finish is enhanced by a noticeable to intense smoke character. So this is exactly how I've always thought of Rauchbier anyways, as being a Märzen that happens to have a fairly intense smoky character. I feel like that is basically what this beer was designed from anyways. It can be a little bit darker apparently, just because of the, again, you're kilning these grains, the ones that are imparting the smoke flavor at least, over an open fire. So that can darken them up a bit more than in a kiln. But otherwise that seems like a solid description to me.
It does. It makes me really thirsty, to be honest with you. And I love the description of it. It's pretty much everything that I want in a smoked beer.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a range of different different styles with some smoke character in it. Rauchbier, a traditional, Märzen looking Rauchbier, is the most. It's what my brain goes to when I hear smoked beer, and I think this is where a lot of other brewers who are out there experimenting with smoked malts, this is where they start, and they kind of branch off from here. So, in terms of the appearance, we already discussed a little bit. It's supposed to be a deep amber to coppery brown color. It can be a little bit darker than a classic Märzen, like I said, because of the use of grains that are kilned over an open fire. Very clear clarity. This is a lager after all. It shouldn't be hazy, nothing like that. And the foam should be large, creamy, rich, and tan to cream colored. Again, to me, if you poured a glass of Märzen and a glass of Rauchbier next to each other, they're going to look almost identical.
Right. Exactly. The aroma is kind of where they differ, just a little. The blend of smoke and malt varies from imbalance and intensity, just depending on how much smoked malt you're going to use. Beechwood smoke character can range from subtle to a fairly strong finish. Can seem smoky, woody, or even bacon-like.
That sounds delicious.
It does, doesn't it?
Not to me, but yeah, go ahead.
That reminds me, there was a beer that was brewed by Pipeworks out here in Chicago. About 10 years ago, I tried it for the first time, and it was called Pastrami on Rye. And it was one of their smoked beers, and it was fantastic.
Whatever floats your boat, Steve. Whatever.
Exactly.
I'd rather eat my pastrami on rye, but hey, you know what?
Right.
I said, yeah, go with it.
So back to your aroma. It's low to moderate toasty, rich, and malty sweet malt aroma. Low floral or spicy hops is optional. Again, not really looking for the hop presence here, and a very clean fermentation profile. It is a lager after all.
Yeah, and here's the thing with, you think about most lager yeast in general, part of what defines a good lager is that clean fermentation profile. In my opinion, the use of smoked malt is completely covering up anything you're going to get from a lager yeast anyways, for the most part. I know a lot of people out there genuinely believe that these lager yeast are very sensitive and will throw off esters, but even if you did something, I mean, the smoked character in these beers is like the BJCP describes, it can be intense, intentionally intense. So in terms of flavor, it's generally just going to follow the aroma profile, a blend of smoke and malt in varying intensities, yet always, and I like the use of this terminology by the BJCP, it's always mutually supportive. So,
right.
You're going to have that smoke, right? But you're also going to have that malty character, that toasty, rich, Märzen-like malt character. It should be there. If the smoke is covering that up too much, then if you're, competing with a Rauchbier, you may get dinged a little bit for the over intensity of the smoke. The aftertaste can reflect both malt and smoke flavors. Balance in that area is desirable. Again, for the hops, you're not looking to have too much. Low to moderate spicy floral or herbal hop aroma or a flavor is appropriate, but it should be balanced. The bitterness should be nice and balanced. And again, just like in the aroma, there should be a very clean fermentation profile, no esters, no noticeable phenols, though smoke is a phenol, so I could see how that might confuse some people like me. And it should be, the smoke flavor should be clean. This is an interesting note that they make in the BJCP. Ham or bacon flavor is appropriate, apparently, but it shouldn't taste harsh, bitter, burnt, acrid, rubbery, or sulfury.
I think that makes sense. I think that then that kind of lends itself to that, very like uber strong, smoky profile that the style really isn't about. It's not, smoke in big capital letters and then malt in very small letters. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And kind of get that visual of what that looks like and how that relates to the taste. I just think the word balance and harmony kind of works well with this style, and those words mean a lot, I think, because there needs to be some balance with it.
Yeah, I've talked to people who, the thing is depending on the type of smoked malt you use, that's going to determine the intensity of the smoke in your beer. And we'll talk a little bit more about ingredients later, but I do know people who their perception of intense is way different than mine, know, and I think that's definitely my issue with smoked beers is that I want that balance, but to me, balance means very, very little smoke, like just a whisper, as I'm swallowing the beer and I got a smoked beer. Whereas I've got friends who are using 80% of the grist, Beechwood smoked malt. And I'm just like, wow, these are so intense. And to them, that's a smoked beer. So again, the beauty of homebrewing is that we can mess around with things like this. Now the mouthfeel, you're looking, again, same thing as a Märzen, medium body, medium to medium high carbonation, smooth, clean lager character, no notable astringency. The phenolic harshness is inappropriate in this one. So just because you've got smoke in there isn't an excuse to cover up, bad phenols that shouldn't be in the beer.
Exactly.
And a good judge is going to be right. And a good judge is going to be able to distinguish those. So let's go over some of the more vital stats that the BJCP uses to describe a Rauch beer.
Yeah. So for the original gravity, the OG 1050 to 1057, with your final gravity being at 1012 to 1016. Nothing too out of the ordinary there. Your ABV is kept at between 4.8 and 6%. Like we said before, the IBUs very minimal, 20 to 30 IBUs. And the SRM, the darkness of the beer, between 12 and 22. So you get a little bit of that extra color from the smoked malt, I'm sure. And then even with the addition of like a caramel malt, we'll get to the recipe that will construct it a little bit. That'll contribute a little bit to the dark color as well.
Yeah, you think about the IBU, 20 to 30 IBU. That's pretty moderate. There's nothing. It's not too bitter, it's not too not bitter, but I feel like with styles like Rauch beer, when you're using an ingredient like smoke, which is going to confuse a lot of palates. I mean, let's be honest, it's not a very common flavor for most people these days, and then you start adding too much bitterness to that. I've had smoked beers, I've sampled smoked beers before that are just, in my opinion, the smoke character is like, I may not like that personally, but I can get there, I can understand how others might. But when you pair that with overly bitter, it just ruins the whole experience for me. So I think that's an interesting one. I've never made a smoked beer. I think I've talked about that before. But if I'm designing a recipe, I'm aiming for, 20 to 25 IBU tops, because I want that smoke to not come off as harsh. And once you put everything together, it can be difficult to determine what actual flavors, I'm tasting and where that's coming from. So now, just classic ingredients for making a Rauch beer. You're looking for your basic Märzen type grist, plus a sizable quantity of Rauch malts, which is a beechwood smoked malt. I was reading that I think it's Schlenkerlau makes like an oak smoked beer for the holiday season. I mean, there are various other ones. I've seen cherrywood smoked malt, but I think the classic would be beechwood smoked malt, which is purportedly supposed to be a more subtle smoke character. It's not too sharp or aggressive. And then the rest of your grains are going to be continental German, like German Pilsner malts, Munich malts, malts, Vienna malts. Again, your classic Märzen grist. In terms of hops, I don't think it's going to surprise anybody that the go-to here is your traditional German noble hops, so Hallertauer, Tettninger, and Spalter. The BJCP also lists Czech hops like Satz, so any of those noble hops would work. And in terms of yeast, I mean, Steve, we've messed around a lot with, different lager yeast strains, and I think probably the go-to for most people on this style is going to be the Weihenstephan, lager strain, which is Imperial Yeast L13 Global, WLP 830 German Lager, or Y Yeast 2124. But there are some other strains out there people might opt to use, right?
Sure. I mean, you can always look at the Augustiner, which is Imperial's L17 Harvest. White Labs has Munich Lager 860, and then Y Yeast has their Munich 2 2352. So you have plenty to choose from if you're a homebrew shop, either online or a brick and mortar will have those yeast on hand.
Yeah, and there are, any lager strain's going to work. You could probably, I've made German style lagers using the Czech lager strain, the Pilsner Urquell strain. You're going to get away with it as long as that lager yeast is known for being clean, and your traditional brewing process would be a nice, cool fermentation, which we'll get into now. Now, I did some Googling. Maybe you know something I don't, Steve. Mm-hmm. But in looking for like traditional water profiles for a Rauchbier, I couldn't find anything speaking historically. You've got a lot of these older traditional beer brewing regions where it's like, oh, they're, the style of beer like stout, or IPA was sort of a function of the water they had available to them. I couldn't find much for Bamberg, but what I could find was a lot of talk about just a balanced water profile being appropriate and, kind of adjusting your sulfate to chloride based on what you personally prefer. Do you want it to be more crisp? Increase that sulfate level. If you want it more rounded and really emphasize the malt, you can increase the chloride level a little bit. Do you have any other information on the water profile for this style?
No, not really. I mean, like it's, I think with water, it's so, we try to like mimic this, we have this great romantic idea that, I'm going to mimic the great water so I can brew my Czech lager, and it's going to be so soft and, it's going to be great. But I mean, there's only so much that we can do to mimic that. You're kind of left with what you have, and how can you adjust it from there. It's not going to be identical. So I think for a style like this, where you want the smoke to be accentuated, I think a balanced approach would be just fine.
Yeah, that's where I'm at as well. Yeah, is that you're balancing the sulfate to chloride. Make sure you have the right amount of. These are all modern ideas. We're talking more of a traditional way to brew these. But,
exactly.
We're not encouraging that you go down to your local reservoir and filter your own water or whatever. This is
no.
So yeah, and so on the lines of tradition and the way that this beer would have been brewed 100, 200 years ago. When we get to the mash, this is a style with roots in early German brewing, right? Rauchbier. And we know that in early German brewing scenes and circles that decoction mash was used often, primarily as a means of improving conversion efficiency. Many also seem to believe that it positively contributes to the flavor of the beer as well. And, despite the evidence that we've got that doesn't seem to support that piece of it, a lot of people are still, employing a decoction mash when making Rauchbier. If that doesn't float your boat, you can get away with a step mash. And a more modern approach, obviously, would be a single infusion, which I'm keeping clumped in with this way, another more a classic way of brewing a Rauchbier, only because there's nothing new about a single infusion. And it's really more, we're able to do it now because of the advancements in our malting processes and the fact that we've got such hot malt, with us now. So in terms of a boil, what would you do? Classically speaking, you're using a big chunk of Pilsner malt, Steve. So tell us about how you might boil a Rauchbier.
I mean, traditionally speaking, 90-minute boil would be, adequate. So you get the adequate isomerization of the alpha acids and the bitterness, and reduce that risk of that funky old DMS that could be prevalent. However, I don't really get too concerned about DMS.
We've got such good Pilsner malt nowadays, and but again, traditionally speaking, they've got this under modified malt. They've got that are nowhere near as advanced in the malting back then as they were before, and so to drive off that ketchup-y, corn-like flavored DMS, a boil of 90 minutes would be called for. As soon as that boils over, you're going to quickly chill that wort. And by quickly, there's a reason for that. It's to ensure a good cold break so that all that trub falls out to the bottom of the kettle.
Sure.
And then you can rack as little of that as possible to the fermentation vessel. You want to chill that wort down to between 46 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 8 to 11 C, and pitch your yeast. Then you're going to pitch a big ol' amount of yeast because you don't want you want that yeast to be rearing and ready to go. And in that colder environment, you're going to have a higher viability to ensure that, and that no off flavors are developed. And then you're going to ferment it around that same temperature, right around that 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C temperature. And let it go and do its thing. And it's going to take a while because it's nice and cool. And then once that fermentation is fully complete, maybe you ramp it up a little bit for a diacetyl rest, maybe not, but you ensure that there are no off flavors in there before moving into the lagering phase. What is your understanding, Steve, of? I mean, Rauchbier is different than no other lager out there, German lager out there in terms of the lagering, but I know that there are some kind of equations or so that some have come up with for the length of their lagering period.
I typically, if I'm going to lager, which has been far and few between these days, just with the nature of my brewing, I try to keep it at like 4 weeks. And that's really me pushing it and like being very, very patient with it. I've seen in notes that we have done, and even reading online, 4 to 8 weeks is even acceptable. I don't think I'm that patient though for 8 weeks. And again, the nature of our brewing with Brewlosophy, we are cranking things out, sooner than later. So we kind of need to get that stuff out. Not to say that we're, don't care about quality. But if I'm in a pinch and I need to brew something, I'm not going to look towards a lager to brew, if I want to do it in a traditional sense. But yeah, 4 to 8 weeks, I think, for lagering is probably mostly acceptable.
Yeah, and you think about Rauchbier. I was talking to a buddy of mine who really enjoys this style a lot, and he does this thing, or he was doing this thing a few years ago, where he focuses on one specific style, tries to master that, and then moves on to another one. And when he was doing the Rauchbier thing for a few months, what he found was extended lagering really did help the smoke flavor to round out, is how he described it. It lost little bits of that harshness, which is kind of the argument people make for lagering in general, that it really rounds out the malt, that these tiny little particulates that you may not even see, and the beer may be crystal clear after a week, but there's something else that's happening in there, the magic of lagering or whatever. So we talk about things like gelatin as being liquid time or powdered time, and I agree with that. I do think it helps, but in a traditional sense, you're not going to use any form of chemical filtration on this style because it goes against the Reinheitsgebot. So, maybe you could get away with mechanical filtration these days, pushing it through an actual filter, and that's going to help with the lager, reduce the lagering time. But I think for the most part, people who are making this style in a traditional way are going to allow it to sit cold and genuinely lager for 4 to 8 weeks, sometime in there, maybe even a little bit longer. Once it's nice and clear and lagered and tasting how the brewer wants it to taste, though, it gets transferred to some form of a package. Now you have to think about carbonation. Again, this is supposed to be medium to medium high carbonation, I believe. One way to achieve that, I think a kind of a traditional way, would be through krausening, which is a process of taking krausen from a currently fermenting batch, putting it into an almost finished batch, capping that, and then allowing that fermentation to carbonate the beer. Probably not practiced nearly as much these days as it used to be. Because an easier way of kind of doing that, sort of a hybrid krausening, would be spunding, which is just capturing the CO2 towards the end of fermentation and using that to carbonate the beer. And then obviously, and I feel like this fits within a more traditional approach to some degree, just because of the technology available, you can force carbonate this style quite easily as well, and again produce that nice medium to medium high carbonation that makes it so easy to drink.
Yeah, I mean, I think I need to explore this a little bit more because lately, I've noticed in my system, in my Keyser, when I have a beer that's sitting for a little bit, even like my IPAs, I'll get this really nice, soft, pillowy, soft, creamy head on the beer, and I think that would lend itself really well to this style. And it's almost like as if I have a nitro gas on my system, which I don't. But that's just what it reminds me of. So I think that would lend itself really well with this style.
Yeah, that kind of creamy head thing with a nice sparkle in the drink. Yeah, I agree with that. So, we've already discussed a little bit about what a good example of a Rauchbier is going to look and smell and taste like. You're looking for a crisp, clear, flavorful Märzen-like beer with noticeable smoke character in it. That's not so intense to be that it's distracting, and for me, again, I feel like there's such a subjective component to that because for me, it could be very, very not intense and it still distracts the hell out of me. But
right.
For someone like you, Steve, you want that smoke to be prominent, right? I mean, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I want to know that I'm drinking a smoked beer. I think the ones that I have brewed in the past have been that way. And I think that the one that the only one that I really regret it was I did a smoked spruce tip pale ale. And the feedback that I received from friends was that the smoke was a little bit too strong. You really couldn't taste the spruce tips or the hops that I used, which is totally against what we're talking about traditionally here. But that's where I think a softer hand in the including the smoked malt there would have been better.
Yeah.
But I got a little overzealous. Sorry.
Yeah, it's easy to do when brewing and you love one thing and you're like, let's maximize this.
For sure.
I have to believe that there is a recipe out there in someone's mind of a smoked beer, even maybe a Rauchbier, that I would find enjoyable. I have yet to find it yet. And if somebody thinks that they can change my mind, I remain open to doing so. But I have tried some really popular commercial examples like Schlenkerla's Rauchbier Märzen, as well as the, I think it's Spezial Rauchbier Märzen. Those are the two main German commercial examples that I've had, and they do not do it for me. If you had me, like that would have to be like a game for me to have to finish a whole bottle of Schlenkerla. I can't do it. It is so intense to me, and I just don't like that flavor. Are there any other kind of traditional examples that you've had that you feel, people ought to try who are like me, who are looking to try to like it more than we do?
There are some local breweries by me right now that are actually making a lot of good smoked beers. Goldfinger in Downers Grove, which is a suburb west of Chicago. They do phenomenal lagers. And Dovetail in the city of Chicago, they also do a lot of great smoked beers. They have a Rauchbier. They have a smoked porter, I believe. Phenomenal beers. Smoked Helles. You can often find. After that, there's a few here and there that will have something, but like Goldfinger and Dovetail are two that are really like high on my list. Both just as their brewery alone, and then their smoked beers. But the traditional beers, I don't really gravitate towards those too often, and maybe I should, and just start looking around a little bit more.
Yeah, those two, especially Dovetail, right? I've heard quite a bit about them in their smoked program, and I think it's crazy that, like in a cool way, crazy that there's a brewery that is like has that as a focus. I definitely would be open to trying. I love trying new things, even if I don't enjoy it so much personally. I would love to try one and be like, finally. I have a buddy who makes a porter where he uses just a little bit of peat smoked malt, and it's one of my favorite porters ever. But I also don't taste the smoke in it. But
right.
it has that je ne sais quoi.
Exactly.
That's what I've heard. It adds something to it. So, well, the first Rauchbier I ever had was actually a batch brewed by a local buddy of mine who has a penchant for tradition and is an amazing brewer. I hated it. The smokiness did not sit well with my palate. And while I could tell the underlying Märzen was really great, a single taster glass was all I could handle of that beer. I initially thought that maybe he overdid the smoked malt, but then I tried Schlenkerla Rauchbier and nope, that flavor's not supposed to be there for my palate. Well, contributor Will Lovell was curious how a blasphemously brewed Rauchbier would turn out. Those results when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Drive into summer with the Honda CR-V and Accord, your fun-to-drive weekend getaway vehicles. From Honda, the 2024 Kelley Blue Book's KBB.com Best Value brand. So hurry in to the Honda Summer Event. For a limited time, well-qualified buyers can get a 2.9% APR on a 2025 CR-V or 2024 Accord.
See dealer for financing details based on 2024 Consumer Choice Awards from Kelley Blue Book. Visit kbb.com for more information.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
I've brewed well over 500 batches of beer, which has included nearly every style in the BJCP guidelines, but I have never once made a Rauchbier. In fact, I've never even purchased smoked malt before. That's how much I don't like that flavor or this style necessarily. A real testament, to my feelings here, I know. But such is not the case for contributor Will Lovell, who not only enjoys, smoky beers, Rauchbier being one of them, but recently brewed one up using short and shoddy, the short and shoddy approach here. For this batch, he went with a full volume 5 gallon or 19 liter batch. And he actually started the brew day a day before he was brewing by collecting his RO water, which he uses for all the beers he brews, adjusting it with minerals to his desired profile, which in this case was a slightly higher sulfate to chloride ratio, just to emphasize the lagery crispness of this beer. He then weighed out and milled the grains all the night before brewing, and he just left those grains out. So this is something, I don't know how much it gets talked about these days, but back 10, 15 years ago, if you milled those grains and let them sit for 15 minutes before mashing, you were going to have a stale beer. He left them out overnight. So the following morning, what he did is he set his 120 volt electric controller, his electric brewing rig controller, to start heating the brewing liquor up before his workday ended. So these grains and that water were sitting out for almost 24 hours before he actually went out and used them to brew the beer. And then what he did is he put a timer on his electric controller, set that to start, just so that when he would walk out to his garage after his workday, he was working from home, that water would be nice and hot and ready to mash in. And we're going to go with that start time, even though he spent about 15 minutes, getting his water and grains ready the night before. It was 4:52 p.m. So that's when he started actually brewing, and by adding the grains to the brewing liquor and starting his mash.
Yeah, and his grain bill consisted consisted of 46.5% of Munich malt and 46.5% of smoke malt, 5% of Crystal 60 to get a little bit more color, and then 2% of Melanoidin malt, which rounds out his grain bill.
Yeah, this is an interesting recipe. Again, I've never made a Rauchbier, but I've made a lot of Märzen, and I always include a good chunk of Pilsner malt. As somebody who's very unfamiliar with making Rauchbier, I wonder if that smoked malt is basically just Pilsner malt that's been smoked, Beechwood smoked in this case. It was the Weyermann Beechwood smoked malt. So 46.5% there is basically like half of the base malt here is Pilsner malt, just smoky Pilsner malt. Is that kind of the way they look at it? Or would you, if you're designing a recipe, Steve, as somebody who likes the style and has brewed it before, are you going to include any standard non-smoked Pilsner malt?
I probably would fall into the category of what Will did. I don't think I would play around with it too much more than what he did. But I mean, maybe it would be a good comparison to see, what's better to different palates. A little bit more Pilsner malts added to it. I don't know.
Yeah, good. Well, so then he balanced that with a good chunk of Munich malt, which again, when I'm making a Märzen, I'm not using that much Munich malt either. And that is a personal opinion of mine. I like my Märzen to be a little bit more, a little less rich in the malty thing. Munich malt to me, you've heard people describe it as kind of like a wild cherry flavor that it can contribute to beer when used in larger proportions. I don't know if I get cherry from it so much as I just do that. It's overly rich flavored that it's like intense toasty. Yeah. And I prefer to balance that with just some clean Pilsner malt. But this to me looks like I did some poking around looking at other Rauchbier recipes online, and this pretty much fits it. I know some people will ditch the crystal malts altogether and just rely on the Munich malt to get that richness. But overall, it looks decent to me. I know that he based this off of other recipes and such as well. So when the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added. As we mentioned, the water was at strike temperature when he went out to brew, which is pretty awesome. He added the grains, stirred it up, and did a single infusion mash at 151 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius. For how long, Steve, did he let this mash sit?
Just 30 minutes for the mash. After that, his grains were removed. The wort was then boiled for 30 minutes. And he added his hops, 10 grams of Magnum, and 20 grams of Hirschbrucker at 30 minutes, and then another 20 grams of Hirschbrucker at 5 minutes. Again, nothing really out of the ordinary with his hop choice, keeping tradition with the 30 minutes boil and 30-minute mash in the short and shoddy. Yeah, I mean it's short and shoddy, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. When we talk about this on most of the short and shoddy episodes, but when you're designing a beer where that is going to be where the wort's only going to be boiled for half an hour, if we're going to accept the current thinking about bitterness and the hop, alpha acid percentage and the time there in the wort, all of that stuff, then you are going to have to make some adjustments to the way you're hopping that wort if you're cutting the boil in half, or in this case, you're cutting it down by an hour if you're not going with a 90-minute boil.
Yeah.
And so one way to do that is to use a higher alpha hop at that 30-minute mark. And what I'm sure Will was doing there was pairing that high alpha Magnum, which, let's just call it about 12% alpha acid, with this very low alpha acid, probably 3 to 4%, alpha Hirschbrucker, in order to impart the flavor, that you would get from that Hirschbrucker, but along with the bitterness you're going to get from the Magnum. This is something I do on almost every short and shoddy batch I make. And then he goes in with another charge of Hirschbrucker at 5 minutes, which is probably more traditional. You're going to get that in a normal Rauchbier. So
sure.
I think it was a fair way to design the recipe, at least.
Yeah, for sure. I think it does its job, and you want to get that hop bitterness to kind of mellow out the sweetness of, especially with that Munich malt that he's using. So yeah, I see no problem with that at all.
Yep. When the boil was finished, this half-hour boil was finished, he did quickly chill the wort down to 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 C. Now, that was just as cool as he could get the wort with, using his groundwater at the time. And then he immediately transferred that chilled wort, the 77 degree Fahrenheit wort, to his fermentation vessel and took a refractometer reading that showed he was at 1051 OG, which is smack on with what the BJCP says. Excellent, success. It worked out. But, the part that a lot of people complain about with this approach to brewing is that he only got 50% brew house efficiency. Will's typical is somewhere around 68 to 75% when he's not doing short and shoddy. So this is one of those things that you have to consider when designing, a recipe where you're going to abbreviate the mash and the boil, is that, you're going to take a hit to your efficiency a little bit. And in this case, Will was at 50%, but the fact he hit 1051 OG, that in my book is a success. He designed this recipe understanding that hit was going to happen.
For sure. And you kind of compensate for that by adding a little bit more malt in the beginning. With my propensity of having strangely high efficiency on my beers, I wonder if I'll admit I don't do a lot of short and shoddy beers. I'm mostly doing experiments and DIY stuff for philosophy. But I wonder where my efficiency would lie if I do it more often. Maybe I need to get out to the garage and do some more short and shoddies.
Yeah. You could probably go for a nice 2-hour brew day at some point. I think that.
Yeah. It wouldn't be bad.
They may be hectic, but you're done in no time flat. So It's
Right.
pretty cool there. Well, at this point, Will had his 77 degree Fahrenheit wort sitting in his fermentation vessel. He moves that wort into his chamber that he had controlled to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. And the time at this point, he pitched yeast at this point, which was the Imperial Yeast L13 Global, into that warm wort. So it was still 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Definitely not chilling that wort down to proper pitching temps. And then that warm wort is put in his chamber, which is set to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, as I said earlier. The time at this point is 7:16 p.m. So his whole brew day, and mind you, this is a 120 volt electric system, not the big powerful 240 volt system or a propane setup that the rest of us are using. 2 hours and 24 minutes. If you want to add in the time it took him to collect his water and mill his grain the night before, let's just call it 2 hours and 45 minutes tops, and that would include any cleanup as well. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, when you go from a 5 to 6 hour brew day down to sub 3 hours, it feels pretty good. You've still got your day left,
For sure. I've gotten my brew day to about 4 hours these days, so I'm not too far off, but it's an hour of a time is golden these days. So
yeah,
I would cherish that.
So at this point, he let the beer ferment for 5 days, at which time there was no activity left in his airlock activity or his blow off. And so he took a hydrometer measurement that showed the beer was at 1013 FG, again, smack in there with the vital stats provided by the BJCP. And his ABV was 5.1%. Pretty solid. In my opinion, if that's a non-smoky Märzen, I'm looking at it going, man, you nailed it. You got 1051 to 1013, 5.1% ABV. Your colors smack on. All this stuff is looking good. Let's get it packaged. In this case, he cold crashed the beer to 34 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and then he pressure transferred it into a CO2 purged keg. We don't want any oxidation. We're not trying to make a bad beer. We're just trying to make a good beer quicker. And then the beer was burst carbonated at 40 PSI for 15 hours in his keezer before the gas was reduced to serving pressure. And then he let it sit for a couple of weeks. He mentioned to me at the time that the reason he let it sit like that was because he was waiting for tasters, basically. But the beer was basically ready about a week after putting it in the keezer. Carbonated, ready for evaluation at that point. And what do you think? You look at a picture of this beer right now, and to my eyes, if somebody served that to me and I had my nose plugged, I would just think they were serving me a nice, somewhat darker colored Märzen.
For sure. Yeah. It's a pretty looking beer. And I would definitely think the same thing.
It hit the marks for the being a Märzen-like beer for sure. Deep copper color, good clarity, though, not bright. I think that's another thing that we found with short and shoddy beers is they tend to maintain a little bit more haze, which I've heard different theories as to why that could be, but it's definitely clear. You could see your fingers through it, all of that. And it had a really dense cap of a nice tan colored foam. So I think he nailed it in terms of appearance. Now, before he served, we go out and we serve these beers to blind tasters who we tell them the style, but we don't tell them how it was brewed or anything like that. Will did sit down with, a nice glass of this beer and wrote down his thoughts. And he said that it was everything he hoped for when designing this recipe. It had a solid smoke character with malty backbone from the Munich malt, which made it a delight to drink. And he said that he didn't pick up any off flavors in this beer whatsoever, which, he's as biased as they get. He made the beer. We are our own worst critics, and Will is among the camp of people who fits that. And he's sitting there saying, wow, this 2.5 hour beer that I made, this lager that I fermented warm and did all this, it tastes pretty good.
I mean, I really think that that's a definite point in the right direction for short and shoddy brewing, right?
Yeah.
And it's everything you want it to be. And you still have time in your day. I mean, I'm sure this was after work that he did this. So, he works all day from home and then goes out in the garage and brews for a couple hours. I mean, what more do we want, right? So, hey, it sounds good to me.
Well, and home brewing is about making beers that we want to drink, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I talked about this recently in another episode, that this whole, pro brewer idea of I'm going to make the beers I want to drink and people can buy it if they like it doesn't really work these days.
Right.
But when you're home brewing, you're making beer you want to drink. That's the whole purpose. And
Right.
the fact that he liked it as much as he did, despite the method he used to make it, I think is really telling. But of course, we're not going to stop there. He served these beers to 20 tasters. Again, every one of them was informed of the style and asked to evaluate the beer based both on their previous experiences with Rauchbier as well as the BJCP style description, which we provide in the survey. Now, in terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters rated the strongest characteristic, no surprise here, as being its maltiness, which yielded an average of about 3 out of 5. The dryness came in a very close second with a ratio of around 2.7 out of 5, while tasters rated the hoppiness a 2 out of 5. I don't know about you, Steve, but this is right about what I would expect for a Rauch beer.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, it tells me everything that I would want. And the maltiness from the Munich, the dryness from the L17, and then the lack of hoppiness at 2 out of 5. I mean, that's, again, picture perfect, I think.
He's spot on so far, in my opinion, at least with these ratings, of course. Now, after we ask them to rate those generals, we go in and we break down the different things: hop, malt, yeast, flavors, all that stuff. So for hop character, the most prominent hop characteristic noted by these tasters, who again only knew what style of beer it was. They're being told that, hey, this is just a Rauch beer. Here's the description. Give us a rating on all of these different aspects. 8 out of the 20 tasters rated earthy as being the most prominent hop characteristic. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Given the blend of Hersbrucker hop, character, which isn't that strong, with the more pungent smokiness that would have been present in this beer. So I'm on board with that one.
Sure.
Another 7 rated spicy as being the most prominent hop characteristic, and then 1 each rated fruity, pine resinous, floral, dank caddy, and onion garlic. Nobody said melon or berry. That all kind of tracks for me. I don't know. Maybe you're gonna have one-offs. People are gonna perceive things differently. We know that, but the fact that a vast majority of tasters rated either earthy or spicy, that all makes sense to me.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it all again lends itself to this being like the ideal type of beer that you want.
Yeah, at least matching, stylistically matching what the BJCP describes it as, I think is pretty neat so far. Now, we talked earlier about, how the base beer here in a Rauch beer is a Märzen, and that Märzen is very toasty and has that rich toastiness to it in terms of malt character. Well, again, tasters, 9 out of 20 tasters who sampled this beer and evaluated it rated toasty as being the most prominent malt character. Another 5 rated nutty. Another 5 rated roast, which I sort of get.
I get that.
You know, because your brain is like, oh, that smoky thing, roasty. I could see how those two go together.
Yeah.
And then one person rated chocolate, which, okay, I mean, that actually doesn't surprise me too much either. Nobody, which I think is fascinating, nobody endorsed cracker bread crust or caramel sweet, which if I were to serve somebody a Märzen, I would imagine that those two would probably be the most highly rated.
True. Yeah.
But when you add that smoke character, it really does seem to influence, the way people are perceiving that malt character. So you got toasty, nutty, and roast, which are taking the top 3 spots. Makes sense to me.
I wonder if that smoke component dominates the palate more so than a cracker or bread crust flavor would. You know what I mean? And it kind of overpowers it, not in a bad way, but just the senses pick up on it more so, and you just kind of go with that gut instinct of, it's that smokiness or roastiness, which I can understand. Maybe it's the propensity of having a smoked porter or a smoked stout, and like, I remember that from 3 years ago when my brother-in-law gave me that beer or whatever.
Yeah.
That was roasty but smoky too. So,
yeah,
I can see this. Definitely.
Yeah, without a doubt. And you think about it, when was the last time you had a smoky cracker? I mean, those two things don't go together.
Yes.
So it's gonna influence the way that you're perceiving that malt character. So that all tracks again. In terms of yeast character, I don't think this is gonna surprise anybody.
No.
6 out of 20 tasters rated the fermentation character as being clean, but another 6, so an equal amount of tasters rated it as having a phenolic characteristic to it. Mm-hmm. Surprise, surprise, that smoke is a phenol.
Right.
And one of the descriptions that we include on the survey about phenols when they're rating the yeast character is smoky. So it doesn't surprise me at all that some tasters are going to endorse that. Another 3 tasters each rated esters and sulfur, which again, sulfur, that's one of those things that's associated with smoke. The esters, I don't quite understand that. I think the way that we perceive the gestalt of a Rauchbier is quite different because of the influence of the smoke. So it doesn't surprise me too much. And then the final 2 tasters rated there being kind of a wild fermentation character. There's something a little bit off. But I don't know if they felt that it was off, just that it was unique enough to be called wild. I don't know.
Right. Maybe wild meaning something different. I don't know. I would be interesting to have that discussion with somebody that said that. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that, you serve there, when we're serving these beers, we're not asking people, how many Rauch beers have you had, in the time you've been drinking. But I have to imagine it's not a very common style of beer that most of the people we're serving, the survey to have consumed before. They might love it. They might enjoy it, but we're asking them to rate these things based on their perception. And so it's going to be a little bit different. And this is going to be kind of a confusing style, which I think gets well conveyed when it comes to the off flavors question. We ask all tasters to pick out of a list of all of the common beer off flavors, which ones they perceived, if they perceived any at all. Well, 3 people answered that question. Everybody else out of the 20, so 17 didn't perceive any off flavors. 3 people did. One of those people noted acetaldehyde and phenolics. The other 2 just noted phenolics. So if we piece this together with what we know, about smoke being a phenol, it just tracks. It makes a lot of sense that people might endorse that because the description next to phenolics includes smoke,
right.
So is it an off flavor? I don't think so, because it's supposed to be there.
Exactly. Yeah. Off flavor, meaning it's not supposed to be here. Now, is it compared to, say just a regular Märzen? Okay, then fine. But this is a smoked beer. So yeah, I can, it's not an issue, I don't think.
No, I don't think it's a good reflection of whether or not there was actually an off flavor. And you look at what causes, a phenolic character. I mean, a lot of times it's just water chemistry.
Sure.
In this case, we know that's not the issue because Will used RO water and built it up, to his desired mineral profile. I really do think it's just the smoke, the presence of the smoke there. Now, the final 2 questions that we ask, and these are a couple of my favorite because I feel like they're the most telling.
Yeah.
Are how well does this beer represent the style based on the description that we provided for you from the BJCP? And what do you think personally about this beer? Do you like it? So as far as how well this beer represents a true Rauch beer as described by the BJCP, 8 out of 20 of these tasters rated it a 5 out of 5, which blows my mind. I mean, that would, again, this is some of the most subjective stuff out there. But hey, a taster is a taster is a taster, and you've got, you know, a plurality of them or close to saying that this thing is excellent. And then another 9 gave it a 4 out of 5. So 17 people are at a 4 or a 5 out of 5 in terms of how closely, you know, his short and shoddy Rauchbier resembles a good example, commercial example.
Yeah, it's 85% right there. So I would venture to say that this beer was quite successful.
Yeah, I mean, so far, at least in terms of how well it represents the style,
Right,
you know,
right.
2 other tasters rated it a 3 out of 5. One thought it was a 2 out of 5, and then nobody gave it a 1 or a 0 out of 5. So at the very least, what we can say is of these 20 people of varying experiences with Rauchbier, we'll admit that.
Sure.
The majority of them actually thought this was a good, solid example of a Rauchbier. But what did they personally think of it? Did they prefer this beer? Did they like drinking it themselves? Another 8 out of 20 rated it a 5 out of 5, and 4 more gave it a 4 out of 5. So now you've got a majority again,
right,
who are not only saying, yeah, this is a good example of a Rauchbier, and damn, I like it too. I think that's fascinating.
It is, and especially a polarizing style such as Rauchbier, right? Where a majority of people in your homebrew club, I believe that's where Will was doing the tastings with, you know, they're not going to be you know, one to say, oh yeah, you got a smoked beer, you know, have at it. Give me some more. I can think of my club, even the clubs that I'm a part of, and I don't know too many people. I mean, there are some people who will do it just for the sake of, you know, of it being beer and you know, evaluating and stuff like that. And then of course there's always friends that you share it with in your clubs. But yeah, it's fascinating, I think.
Yeah. Well, and then you look at the rest of the data here. Another 5 rated it a 3 out of 5, which, if you ask me, that's your middle ground. Like,
right.
Even I would probably have rated this a 2 or a 1 out of 5 on the preference, because I'm not going to lie and pretend that I like it.
Right.
But I would, you know, I didn't get to taste this, but I would be perfectly fine. It's the reason we ask both of these questions, rating the representativeness of style high while rating my preference low. And in this case, you had 17 people give it a 3, 4, or 5 out of 5. Only one person gave it a 2 out of 5. 2 people did rate it a 1 out of 5. Those are my homies there. And then nobody gave it a 0 out of 5. So, you know, and I'm just messing around because it's Will and he can take it. But I have to imagine that this was a very good version or example of a Rauchbier made using all of these corner cutting, you know, techniques. And I just think it's so cool to know that somebody out there who may not have as much time to you know, do a full-fledged old school, you know, 18th century German brewing approach can go to their homebrew shop, pick up these ingredients, and in 3 hours have a beer fermenting in their chamber that turns out, you know, really good, based on what actual tasters think about it. And you just got to mind the stuff that really does matter while taking, you know, shortcuts where you can. So to me, that seems really cool. You know, obviously the ratings on the off flavor thing or that fermentation character of being phenolic, I think we have to take that with a big grain of salt, given the style and what we know of smoke and phenols. But other than that, you know, it seems this short and shoddy process did the job again, despite their, you know, the grains being left out overnight, and 30-minute mash, a 30-minute boil, no decoction, you know, a warm pitch temp, fermentation temperature was way too warm. He didn't lager it for 4 years. I mean, the beer came out good anyways, and I think we have a lot to learn from that. So that's super duper cool. Now we do have one reader comment I thought we should get to. This one comes from Joe D, who says, "It looks great. I have a Rauchbier on tap myself that was based on the published NHC gold medal from last year. That was 2023, that uses 38.7% smoked malt. So a little bit less than Will there. I think if I pushed it higher, the guys in my club and I would be the only ones drinking it. My non-brewing friends can only handle 1 pint of it now." So Joe, I will tell you that I don't even know if I could handle a whole pint of it. I could force myself through it, but it wouldn't be an enjoyable experience for me.
That sounds awesome. I would love to try that beer from Joe. That'd be great.
Yeah, I really would love to have tried this beer, you know, made by Will.
For sure.
You know what I mean? It just I just love, like, there's something I get out of sampling these experimental, you know, things. It's more fun than just trying a perfect example of a beer, in my opinion. So kudos to Will for making what seems to be a really great Rauchbier.
For sure.
And That brings us to the end of this episode. I think that about covers most things Rauchbier. Steve, was there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Just we spent a lot of time with Brulosophy talking about experimenting and whatnot, and we it seems like we kind of take jabs at like the traditional sense of brewing, German traditional brewing, namely, but by no means are we really like, it's kind of tongue in cheek, and I respect it immensely, and I for one who likes history, that's where I'm coming from. Am I doing decoctions? No, I'm not. But I think that there's a certain place for it with certain people, if you're really, really into that. But with that said, and kudos to that traditional sense of brewing. But, Will's beer here was a fine example of something that can be done in a short and shoddy way and come out really good. So I would venture to guess that more short and shoddy brewing methods should be taking place. I know they're going to be for me. I like the time factor, and I really do want to test out my efficiency with that, and kind of see where it goes. So drink that Rauchbier. I like it.
Yeah, man. I wish I could join that club, and I've tried. I will continue to try it, but I'm with you. There is no intention on our part to poo-poo people who are doing things differently than us. We do seem to get more crap slung our way because of people presuming that we're promoting a certain approach. We are not, but we like to talk about a wide variety of approaches, and
just a different approach. That's all.
That's exactly it. And if somebody can get away with brewing a batch of beer in 3 hours that somebody else enjoys brewing in 8 hours, then you do you. Right. And I will come and hang out with you on a brew day and drink your beer and not talk bad about you. But the train goes both ways. It takes two to tango, and let's all dance together. So
there you go.
That is all the time we've got for this episode. Please remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts, so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget that you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Rauchbier. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.